The wobbly walk. Toby watched Mrs. Higgins shuffle down the hallway, her gait a peculiar sway from side to side. One shoulder dipped lower than the other with each step, creating a rhythm that looked almost comical. He snickered, nudging Mark, who was busy trying to balance a stack of library books. "Check out Mrs. Higgins. What's up with her walk?" Mark glanced up, then back down at his precarious tower. "Leave her alone, Toby. She's all right." "All right?" "She looks like a penguin that lost a fight with a washing machine." Toby exaggerated the janitor's movements, wobbling down the hall, arms stiff at his sides. He even added a squawk for good measure, earning a few chuckles from the cluster of kids by the water fountain. Emboldened by the attention, he repeated the performance, putting even more gusto into the impersonation. The laughter grew louder, bouncing off the freshly waxed floors. He even began to add a narrative to his mimicry. "Oh dear, I'm Mrs. Higgins, and I need to mop up this. Imaginary spill. Excuse me, children, while I navigate this treacherous hallway of doom." He punctuated his routine with another exaggerated wobble, nearly tripping over his own feet. The air suddenly felt colder. Toby straightened, the laughter dying in his throat. Mrs. Higgins stood a few feet away, her face unreadable. The fluorescent lights glinted off her thick-rimmed glasses. He'd been so caught up in his performance, he hadn't noticed her approach. Panic clawed at his insides, that familiar, icy dread he usually reserved for the basement stairs after dark. He stammered, "Mrs. Higgins, I wasn't." She held up a hand, silencing him. No anger flashed in her eyes, no fire in her voice. Just a quiet observation. "Having a bit of fun, were we, Toby?" He could only nod, shame burning his cheeks. He expected a lecture, a trip to the principal's office, maybe even extra chores. Anything but this unnerving calm. Her lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a cruel smile, or even a pitying one. It was, knowing. A smile that hinted at stories he couldn't even begin to imagine. "You know," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "balance is a funny thing. Sometimes it looks like you're wobbling, but really, you're just finding your center." She didn't say another word, just turned and continued her wobbly walk down the hall, the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes echoing in the sudden silence. Toby watched her go, the laughter of the other kids forgotten. His earlier bravado evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache of guilt and a prickle of unease. He glanced down at his own perfectly balanced sneakers. What was her center? What had made her walk that way? The questions buzzed in his brain like trapped wasps. The hall seemed suddenly longer, the shadows deeper. He shivered, though the temperature hadn't changed. He knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in his stomach, that he'd seen only the surface of Mrs. Higgins. And he had a feeling that the stories beneath were far more interesting, and far more complicated, than he could ever have guessed. The memory of her smile sent a fresh wave of guilt through him. He wasn't sure what to do with the feeling, but he knew one thing, he wouldn't be mocking Mrs. Higgins' walk again. Laughter in the locker room. The metallic slam of Max's locker reverberated through the otherwise empty hallway. Toby bounced on the balls of his feet, a restless energy buzzing beneath his skin. Lily, fiddling with the combination lock on her own locker, barely glanced up. All right, settle down, Maxwell," Max said, grinning. "What's got you so wound up?" Toby puffed out his chest. "You will not believe what happened in history today. Mrs. Higgins was going on and on about the War of 1812, right? And she starts doing this thing with her glasses." He hitched his nose up, peering over an imaginary pair. "And the British, you see, they just would not listen." He deepened his voice, making it waver and crack. Max doubled over, already chuckling. Lily, however, only offered a polite, tight-lipped smile. Toby, fueled by Max's reaction, launched into a full-blown impersonation. He hunched his shoulders, mimicking Mrs. Higgins' slightly stooped posture. He waved an invisible pointer stick, knocking against the lockers as he explained the complexities of naval warfare. Now, class, pay attention. This is crucial. Crucial, I say. He punctuated the sentence with a dramatic cough that sounded suspiciously like a strangled seal. Max was practically weeping with laughter, clutching his stomach. Oh, man, Toby, you're gonna get detention for sure one day. Lily finally managed to open her locker. She began meticulously arranging her textbooks. It's not really that funny, Toby, she said quietly, not making eye contact. She's just trying to teach us. Toby deflated slightly, the laughter receding from his face. He hadn't really thought about how it might look. He glanced at Lily, her expression unreadable. I know. It's just, she's so intense. He struggled to articulate his feelings, suddenly feeling a little foolish. Max clapped Toby on the back, oblivious to the subtle shift in atmosphere. Intense is an understatement. She's like a history-obsessed drill sergeant. Toby perked up, seizing the opportunity to regain his audience. Exactly. And the way she walks. It's like she's expecting a bayonet charge at any moment. He puffed out his chest again and began a comical march, his arms stiff at his sides. He even tried to mimic the way Mrs. Higgins' sensible shoes squeaked on the linoleum. Max roared with laughter again, but Lily remained unmoved, her gaze fixed on the contents of her locker. A small, nagging feeling of guilt tugged at Toby. He knew, deep down, that Lily was right. It wasn't very nice to make fun of Mrs. Higgins. But the laughter, the attention, it was too tempting to resist. The fear of the dark felt very distant in the glow of the locker room lights and the warmth of his friend's approval. The gathering storm. The fluorescent lights of Mrs. Davison's history classroom flickered, struggling against the sudden gloom that had swallowed the afternoon. Outside, the sky had turned the bruised purple of a plum just before it rots. A gust of wind rattled the windows, making Toby Maxwell jump in his seat. Whoa, check out that sky, he exclaimed, swiveling around to face the window, nearly knocking over Lily Chen's meticulously organized notebook in the process. Lily sighed, writing her notebook. Careful, Toby. And yes, I see it. It looks ominous. Ominous is an understatement, Toby retorted, puffing out his chest. Looks like something out of a movie. I bet there's a monster brewing in those clouds. He lowered his voice to a theatrical whisper. Maybe even dragons. Mrs. Davison cleared her throat, her voice sharp and cutting through Toby's dramatics. All right, settle down, class. That's quite enough sky-gazing. And Toby, please face forward. It appears we're in for a rather severe thunderstorm. The school has issued a warning. We'll keep the blinds drawn and avoid using electronic devices until it passes. A collective groan rippled through the room. No phones. The horror. Even Toby seemed a little less enthusiastic about his imagined dragons. He hated storms, especially the dark ones. Lily, ever practical, pulled a small, battery-operated fan from her backpack. Just in case the power goes out and it gets stuffy, she explained, placing it on her desk. Mrs. Davison resumed her lecture, but it was clear her heart wasn't in it. She kept glancing nervously at the windows, her hand hovering near the light switch. The air crackled with a strange, expectant energy. It wasn't just the storm brewing outside, there was an undercurrent of unease that seemed to permeate the very walls of the school. Then it hit. A blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room for a split second, followed by an ear-splitting crack of thunder that made everyone jump, even Mrs. Davison. Toby yelped, instinctively grabbing Lily's arm. Relax, Toby, she said, gently prying his fingers loose. It's just thunder. But her voice lacked its usual calming confidence. She, too, felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. The storm was more than just a weather event, it felt like a harbinger of something darker, something more sinister. The lights flickered again, then died, plunging the classroom into near darkness. A few students gasped. Toby whimpered. The rain began to fall in sheets, battering against the windows like angry fists. The gathering storm had arrived, and with it, the promise of chaos. Lights out. Toby pressed his face against the window, the glass cool against his forehead. Another flash of lightning illuminated the courtyard, momentarily turning the rain-slicked cobblestones into a shimmering, silver lake. Whoa, he breathed, momentarily forgetting his earlier anxieties about the upcoming exam. Did you see that one, Lily? It was practically right outside. Lily, hunched over her textbook, barely glanced up. Yeah. Very impressive. Can we try to focus? I still haven't memorized the quadratic formula. Toby, emboldened by the spectacle and the distraction it provided, abandoned his pretense of studying. Come on, Lily, live a little. It's like a freaking light show out there. Maybe school will get cancelled. Just as he said it, a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the entire building. This time, even Lily jumped. The fluorescent lights above them flickered erratically, buzzing like angry bees. Okay, Lily admitted, finally looking up, a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. That was a bit much. Another flicker, this one longer, more pronounced. The buzzing intensified, then ceased abruptly. The lights winked out, plunging the classroom into near darkness. A collective gasp swept through the room. Lights out, someone yelled, followed by nervous giggling. Toby, initially thrilled, felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The darkness wasn't exciting anymore, it was oppressive. He could hear the rain lashing against the windows now, a relentless, drumming sound. He reached for Lily's arm, his fingers brushing against her sleeve. Suddenly, a piercing shriek sliced through the darkness. The fire alarm. Panic erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as students scrambled to their feet, their voices a cacophony of shouts and cries. Toby clung to Lily, his hand gripping her arm tightly. What do we do? Lily, despite her own apprehension, seemed to regain her composure. Stay calm. We need to get out of here. Remember the evacuation route? Her voice, though shaky, cut through the rising din. The red emergency lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The strobing effect was disorienting. Toby squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting back a wave of nausea. Lily pulled him forward. Come on. This way. She navigated through the chaotic throng, her hand a firm anchor in the darkness. The blare of the alarm was deafening, each pulse a hammer blow against his skull. He could hear the frantic murmur of other students, some crying, some shouting for their friends. The air was thick with the scent of dust and ozone. This wasn't the exciting storm he had imagined. This was terrifying. He stumbled, nearly tripping over a discarded backpack. Lily steadied him, her grip surprisingly strong. Almost there, she yelled, her voice barely audible above the din, just a little further. Lost in the dark. The lights stuttered again, a jaundiced flicker that amplified the crowd's panic. Move, people, move. Toby yelled, the words a thin shield against his own rising fear, meant as much for himself as for Max and Lily. The promised tempest had crashed down with operatic drama, and the old school building, never sturdy to begin with, groaned under the relentless assault of wind and rain. Ever the pragmatist, Lily snatched a slim flashlight from her bag. A beam of pure white pierced the murk, a fragile guide in the churning sea of students. Stay together, she called, her voice strained, a timbre of unease Toby hadn't registered before. Even Lily was shaken. The human river surged onward, each individual desperate to breach the bottleneck of the hallway and reach the relative sanctuary of the buses. Usually nimble, Toby found himself jostled and shoved, a helpless cork in the current. A backpack slammed into his temple, blurring his vision for a disorienting second. He stumbled, caught himself, and a cold knot of dread clenched in his stomach. Max and Lily were gone. Max? Lily? His cry vanished, devoured by the storm's ravenous appetite outside and the cacophony within. He strained to see over the bobbing heads, a sea of anonymous silhouettes swallowed by the gloom. He thrust forward, hoping for a glimpse of Lily's sunshine-yellow raincoat or Max's flame-red hair. Nothing. Just the relentless push of bodies, the cloying scent of damp fabric and cheap cologne, and the icy grip of despair tightening around his heart. He was adrift. He backtracked, but the corridor had become a bewildering labyrinth in the dimness. He collided with the unyielding steel of lockers, the clang echoing like a death knell in the sudden lulls between thunderclaps. Each impact hammered at his resolve. Lily's beam had been their lifeline, now, he felt as good as blind. His hand scraped along the cool metal, seeking some familiar landmark. Was this the senior hallway, or had he somehow strayed into the freshman territory? Everything felt foreign, warped by the darkness and the rising tide of his anxiety. He pictured Mrs. Gable, the janitor, probably lumbering through the depths of the school, her orthopedic shoes squeaking down these very corridors. A shiver traced its way down his spine, part fear, part chill. He'd always snickered at her peculiar waddle, the way she patrolled the school like a guard on duty. Now, he craved her presence, a stable anchor in this swirling chaos. He tripped over something, a forgotten bag, perhaps, and sprawled onto his knees. The air rushed from his lungs, and for a moment, he simply knelt there, adrift and utterly isolated. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperately summoning calm. He had to find Max and Lily. He had to escape this nightmare. But the darkness felt like a heavy shroud, and his fear was a crushing weight. Utterly, hopelessly lost. Echoes in the hall. Toby Maxwell, initially thrilled by the rogue lightning illuminating the Gothic arches of the hallway, was now thoroughly terrified. The thunder had become a relentless barrage, each boom shaking the very foundations of Blackwood Academy. The other students, freed from the oppressive silence of evening study, were in a frenzy. Shouts bounced off the stone walls, a cacophony of fear and nervous energy. Some huddled together, whispering prayers. Others darted back and forth, desperate for an escape from the echoing hallway, as if the storm itself was a monster they could outrun. A girl with fiery red hair was trying to pry open a window, her efforts clumsy and frantic. Another, tears streaming down her face, was convinced the roof would collapse. Toby himself felt a tremor run through his legs, a primal urge to flee. He imagined the ancient gargoyles perched atop the building, animated by the storm, ready to pluck them from the halls. Then, a different sound cut through the chaos. A rhythmic, heavy thud. It was distinct, deliberate, and utterly out of sync with the panicked shuffle of the students. Thud. 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 Combat boots. Heads turned. The shouting softened, then stuttered to a complete stop. The girl wrestling with the window froze, her hands still gripping the latch. Even the crying girl sniffled, her sobs momentarily forgotten. The sound grew louder, closer, each footfall a stark declaration in the sudden silence. Thud. 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 Mrs. Higgins. Toby swallowed hard. He hadn't seen her since the incident with the janitor's walk. He hadn't wanted to see her. But now, in the face of the storm's unleashed fury and the students' rising panic, her presence was reassuring. She rounded the corner, her expression unreadable. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a strand out of place. Her uniform, usually immaculate, was slightly rumpled, as if she'd been roused from sleep. But her eyes were sharp, focused, taking in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. The storm raged outside, but within the hall, a different kind of calm began to settle. Not peace, exactly, but a sense of order, a feeling that someone was finally in control. She stopped in the center of the hallway, her gaze unwavering. The thunder cracked again, a deafening roar that seemed to test her resolve. But Mrs. Higgins didn't flinch. She simply stood there, a silent sentinel against the storm, her combat boots planted firmly on the stone floor. The echoes in the hall now belonged solely to her. The guiding light. Panic clawed at Toby's throat, choking him. The acrid smell of smoke stung his nostrils, and the flickering emergency lights cast grotesque shadows that danced on the walls of the hallway. He was frozen, his mind a blank slate of terror. Then, a figure emerged from the gloom, bathed in the eerie red glow of the emergency exit sign. Mrs. Higgins. Toby blinked. Mrs. Higgins, the librarian, with her sensible shoes and perpetually cardigan-clad frame, looked different. The emergency light seemed to sculpt her features, highlighting a sharpness he hadn't noticed before. Her usual gentle smile was replaced by a firm, resolute expression. In the chaos, she was an island of calm. "All right, everyone," her voice cut through the rising tide of fear. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, commanding attention like a spotlight in the dark. "No need to panic. We're going to evacuate in an orderly fashion." Toby felt a sliver of hope pierce through his fear. Mrs. Higgins was in charge. Mrs. Higgins knew what to do. "Toby, you and Maria," she pointed, her gaze unwavering, "check the classrooms on the left. Make sure everyone is out. Quickly, but carefully. The rest of you, stay close to the walls and follow me." He hesitated, his legs leaden. "But, the smoke. Hold your shirts over your mouths and noses. It's just precautionary. Move, Toby." There was no room for argument in her voice, only a quiet urgency that spurred him into action. He grabbed Maria's arm, and together they stumbled towards the nearest classroom, pulling their shirts over their faces as Mrs. Higgins had instructed. The air grew thicker, the smell of burning plastic intensifying. He coughed, his eyes stinging. Inside the classroom, desks were overturned, chairs scattered haphazardly. Thankfully, it was empty. They moved on to the next, then the next, each room a nerve-wracking check for stragglers. Meanwhile, Mrs. Higgins led the remaining students down the hall, her pace steady and deliberate. She moved with a surprising agility, her usually slow gait replaced by a purposeful stride. She scanned the surroundings constantly, her eyes sharp, assessing the situation. "Keep low," she instructed, her voice calm but firm. "The air is cleaner near the floor." She guided them around fallen debris, her hand gently steering a trembling girl who looked like she might collapse. As they reached the end of the hallway, the emergency exit loomed, a beacon of hope in the smoky haze. Mrs. Higgins pushed open the heavy door, revealing the cool night air outside. "Come on, everyone," she urged. Almost there. One by one, the students filed out, coughing and sputtering, but safe. Toby and Maria emerged from the hallway moments later, their faces grimy with soot. Mrs. Higgins nodded, her gaze briefly softening as she looked at them. "Good work," she said, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Now, let's get you outside." As Toby followed Mrs. Higgins into the night, he couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude, mixed with a healthy dose of awe. He'd always thought of Mrs. Higgins as just the librarian, a quiet, unassuming figure in the background. But tonight, she was something else entirely. Tonight, she was their guiding light. A change of heart. Toby huddled behind a wilting ficus in the school's main hall, its broad leaves offering little actual concealment but a surprising amount of psychological comfort. The chaos hadn't lessened. If anything, the persistent, low hum of panic had amplified, punctuated by shrill cries and the thud of running feet. But something else had changed. He saw Mrs. Higgins, her gray bun somehow still perfectly intact, directing a group of younger students toward the gymnasium. She wasn't shouting or panicking. Her voice, though firm, was a calming counterpoint to the rising tide of fear. Toby watched, mesmerized, as she efficiently organized them, herding the stragglers with a gentle hand on their shoulders, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd, assessing their needs. One small girl, face streaked with tears, clung to Mrs. Higgins' leg. She knelt, spoke softly to the child, then extracted a small, foil-wrapped chocolate from her pocket. The girl's sobs subsided as she unwrapped the treat. It was competent. Utterly, unexpectedly competent. He remembered his earlier mockery, the way he'd mimicked her gait with Marcus behind the bike sheds, the snide remarks about her sensible shoes. Shame washed over him, a hot, unpleasant tide. He'd seen her as a figure of fun, a harmless, slightly ridiculous fixture of the school. He hadn't seen this. This quiet authority, this unwavering dedication. The gymnasium doors swung shut behind the last of the children. Mrs. Higgins straightened, her gaze sweeping across the hall. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as they passed the ficus. Toby instinctively shrank further behind the plant, his heart hammering against his ribs. She couldn't see him, could she? Then, she moved on, heading toward the administration office. He watched her go, the knot in his stomach tightening. He couldn't just hide here, paralyzed by fear and guilt. He had to do something. Anything. He pushed himself away from the ficus, the leaves rustling in protest. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the tremor in his hands. He had to apologize. And, maybe, just maybe, he could help. He hurried after her, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Mrs. Higgins," he called out, his voice cracking with nerves. She stopped, turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes steady and alert. "Toby," she said, her voice calm. "Are you all right?" He swallowed hard. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he stammered. For before. I was being an idiot." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps understanding, crossed her face. "That's very good of you to say, Toby. And," he continued, gathering his courage, "is there anything I can do to help?" Boots and bravery. The fluorescent lights flickered back to life, buzzing like angry wasps released from a jar. Toby blinked, the artificial brightness assaulting his eyes after the long stretch of near darkness. The howling wind outside had diminished to a sullen whine, and the drumming rain softened to a sporadic patter against the windows. A collective sigh swept through the huddled students. He risked a glance at Mrs. Higgins. She stood as she had before, unflinching, but now a faint sheen of perspiration glistened on her forehead. The janitor's mop lay discarded near the emergency exit, and Toby suddenly felt a surge of guilt for his earlier mockery. Principal Stern bustled into the cafeteria, his usually impeccable hair disheveled, his face pale. "Is everyone all right?" "Mrs. Higgins, what happened here?" "Just a bit of weather, Principal," Mrs. Higgins replied, her voice calm and steady. "Everyone's safe." Stern's gaze landed on the overturned tables and scattered chairs. "But, the mess." He wrung his hands. Then, his eyes met Mrs. Higgins and something shifted in his expression. "You kept them safe. You're a credit to this school, Mrs. Higgins. A true hero." He actually choked up a little. The other teachers started murmuring their agreement, shooting grateful glances at the unassuming woman in the worn uniform and combat boots. Toby felt his cheeks burn. He had never considered Mrs. Higgins as anything other than a figure of ridicule, the butt of his immature jokes. As the principal began directing students back to their classrooms, Toby lingered. He shuffled his feet, avoiding Mrs. Higgins's gaze. "Mrs. Higgins," he mumbled. She turned, her expression neutral. "Yes, Toby." I'm sorry," he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "For laughing. For everything." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Apology accepted, Toby." She paused, then gestured to her boots. "These old things have seen a lot. More than hallways and classrooms, you see. Before I took this job, I worked with a disaster relief organization. Earthquakes, floods, places where people needed help, fast. Toby stared at the scuffed leather, imagining her navigating treacherous terrain, facing down chaos and fear. He pictured her not with a mop, but with a first aid kit, a lifeline in a desperate situation. The walk, she continued, her voice softening. It's not just how I walk, it's how I have to. An old injury, from carrying someone out of a collapsed building. It flares up now and then. She touched her knee, a flicker of pain crossing her face. These boots, she added, looking down at them again. They remind me to keep going, even when it hurts. Even when I'm scared. Toby swallowed hard. He finally understood. It wasn't a funny walk. It was a testament to her strength, her resilience, her quiet bravery. And the boots? They weren't just boots. They were a story. A story he was only beginning to grasp.